People are going to be critical of athletes, of anyone who's in the public eye, regardless, right? And they love you when you're up and they kick you when you're down, and that's just kind of part of it, right? That's how it goes.
On today's episode of the Sports Talk Tech podcast, I'm joined by DwaineLillyFeder, a distinguished doctoral student at Purdue University, to discuss athlete activism, particularly at the collegiate level. Lilly has a wealth of experience in the world of sports communication, both as an educator and practitioner. Her research is a compelling exploration into athlete activism, crisis communication, and organizational behavior in sports. But she also brings a unique perspective as a former Division I athlete and a seasoned athletic administrator, both at the collegiate and professional levels. We weaved her insights from her latest paper on collegiate athletes' communicative constitution of activism and discuss how athletes today are using their platforms for social change. I hope you enjoy this conversation. Lilly, thank you for joining me on the Sports Talk Tech podcast. How are you doing?
Thank you for having me. I'm just great. How about you?
I'm doing well, and I'm much better to see you and to be in conversation with you. And I always think that I should start with a really lightweight question for
perfect.
the topic that we're covering today. And for me, why is athlete activism so polarizing?
Okay, well, I think that you can think about this in terms of like the way that you enjoy sports consumption yourself. So most sports fans are drawn to watching athletes compete because they want to be entertained, right? And there's a lot of research that shows that sports fans engage in like vicarious achievement and kind of escapism, right, when they watch athletic events. And so, you know, we have a long day at work, right, or at school, and we want to enjoy ourselves. We want to decompress. We want to relax. And so we turn on a game and we get really excited. If we're a LeBron fan, let's say LeBron dominates, scores a ton of points, the Lakers win, we feel like we've accomplished something, right? Because we kind of feel like athletes are extensions of us. We take pride in their accomplishments almost as if they're our own. And so that's what we're going for when we tune into athletic events. We don't want to be reminded of the ills of society, right? And so when athletes engage in activism, particularly within the competition space, and Colin Kaepernick's a really good example, right? Kneeling during the national anthem, that's not what people are tuning in for, right? That's not what they signed up to consume, and it kind of pops their bubble because a lot of this is subconscious. And so, you know, I'm not saying to myself, oh yes, I would love nothing more than to just watch this game and I hope that no one reminds me of politics during it before I turn it on, right? But that is how I feel. And so when Kaepernick kneels and brings in all of these societal issues, we tend to feel that he is politicizing a space that shouldn't be political, right? And so that's why people become really polarized. A lot of fans get really upset about that.
Yeah, in general, I think I agree with you, but I think if we reflect on history, I often wonder if, as a society, if we've not learned that most of the times when athletes go out of their way, risk their careers, they tend to be on the right side of history. We could go back to Muhammad Ali. We could think about what happened to Tommy Smith and John Carlos. Even most recently, thinking about Serena and boycotting Indian Wells for a long period of time. And I wonder if these same fans who maybe adore these athletes, or sometimes they don't adore them after a while when they start to bring social issues in front of their in front of your face, if when you reflect on a long career and when time goes by, you recognize that what those people are standing for is actually the right thing. And actually, they really needed the space of sports because a lot of people are watching to somehow shed light on that. So you think about it. How as society that we can't learn from this? Or are we just fixed into this mindset of shut up and dribble, give me the entertainment that I need because my life at Google sucks?
I think that it's a little bit more complex than that. I think that people are different, right? So If I see Colin Kaepernick kneeling or Simone Biles withdrawing from competition to protect her mental health, right, and speaking out as an advocate of mental health, I'm going to react to that very differently as a person who studies these things, who buys into athletes' identity as encompassing much more than just a performer, just a competitor, right? I'm going to take more interest in it. I'm probably not going to be triggered by it. But some people just don't care, right? A lot of people, I think American society is very individualistic, right? And so it's not in everyone's nature to try to understand why people are doing certain things, right? So if you, at the end of a long day, just want to watch sports and you've been looking forward to it, it got you through the work day, right? And you come home and, oh yes, here we go, I'm going to get that break. And then all of a sudden, activism, and you feel like maybe you're watching the news instead of watching an athletic event all of a sudden, you're going to get irritated by that probably. And so I'm not saying that that's best or that that's even justified, but I think it is a natural way of processing these kinds of events for a very large segment of society. And I think also you have to think about the different audiences for different sports leagues. So if you think about the NBA's fanship, it looks very different than the NFL's fanship, right? And I think, you know, again, fan bases are diverse, people are different. However, there are a great number of fans who love watching the NFL who can't quite identify with the majority of the athletes who compete in the NFL. And so I think that's a factor as well.
No, I think you're absolutely right on that. And thanks for kind of schooling me on this or reminding me about this, because I'm often gung-ho on like, look, you should recognize that that individuals and athletes are much more than sporting stars, and they're human beings too. They respond to communities, they have family, and they oftentimes are extremely brilliant individuals that, you know, they also excel at sports. So, and they really want to make a difference. And if we often think that professional athletes are vulnerable to this, I think you study a group of individuals who are probably even more vulnerable. So you and your colleagues just recently published a really cool paper. If I get it right, we need to take our world up. Is that the name of it?
We need to wake our world up.
Yeah, we need to wake our world up.
Wake up, everybody.
Yeah. I need to wake up. So collegiate athletes and communicative constitution of activism. And I guess it, in a way, it explores athletes and, you know, how they participate, and particularly the kind of platforms collegiate athletes use to drive social change. So why did you write that paper?
So my co-authors and I became really interested in looking specifically at collegiate athlete activism actually during the pandemic. And the reason why is because when I was a collegiate athlete, it was pretty clear, very cut and dry. We were explicitly told, you know, anything contentious, keep your mouth shut. You're a representative of the university and the athletic department and the team and et cetera, right? It's a pretty long list. And so just don't get involved. Social media was not as popular. It was very young when I was in college. And so that was another thing that I think is very different right now. Social media is in its prime and everybody's on it, everyone's using it. But during the pandemic in particular, my colleagues and I noticed that there was a huge uptick in participation. So it's not new. It's not that this is the first time that collegiate athletes are engaging. That's not it at all. However, it seemed many more collegiate athletes were engaging. And we also started noticing that, hey, there's some college coaches that are marching alongside their athletes. There are some administrators who are hosting town halls, right? And so it seemed to be much more of a coordinated kind of effort. And so that was really interesting to us, but mostly recognizing not only the constraints that collegiate athletes face as, you know, members of college institutions and also athletic organizations within those institutions, but also amid the pandemic when you can't or you couldn't for a while organize or speak, you know, face to face. That was cut off. And so we became really interested in the strategies that they employed. and in the ways that they went about organizing their efforts in the face of those constraints.
I know it's a deep academic study, deep in a lot of communication theory, but if you wanted to tell a wider audience about it, like what were you able to uncover?
Yeah, so we had some pretty broad research questions with this study. We really just wanted to get a sense for how collegiate athletes organize their efforts and for how they engage in activism. And what we found was that athletes will go either online and or offline, right, for their activism. Most of our participants engaged in activism in a wide variety of ways. So we didn't have a single participant who said, nope, I'm just doing this online or I'm just doing this offline. And that was really interesting to us. And what we found too was that they had different reasons for engaging on different platforms in different ways, right? So we found that there were the online and offline channels that athletes would gravitate toward. And then the activities of activism that our participants engaged in were fiscal, right, ideological, and organizational. And so fiscal activism, I think, is a really interesting one for the setting of collegiate athletics, because most college athletes, and it may be different now, in the era of NIL, but historically, almost no collegiate athlete would have their own funds to donate, right? So fiscal activism is really interesting, and the participants that we spoke with primarily would set up like drives and fundraisers and things like that where they could generate money in some way to then donate to a cause of interest or a particular organization supporting a cause of interest. So that was really interesting, but we also looked at the approaches that athletes were taking, and specifically in terms of approach, I'm talking about, are you calling in or calling out in your effort? I think cancel culture obviously is huge. People get canceled all the time for missteps of various degrees, right? And so we were interested in, Professor Loretta Ross kind of coined the term calling in. And that is basically the opposite of calling out, right? Instead of just pointing out your error, I'm going to call you in. I'm going to tell you, right? I'll call you out on what it is that you've done, but I'll illustrate to you, demonstrate what mistake you've made, how you've made it, and why that is negative, right? Why that can be harmful. And so it's more of a kind of two-way interaction. So we were interested in seeing, are college athletes doing both? Are they just doing one, and why?
Yeah, that's a lot of stuff. I'm really fascinated by this, and maybe you're about to answer a lot of questions that I already have. So I guess you're reading my mind, but I wanted to reflect a little bit on a couple of things that you said. So one thing that fascinated me, and I'm not quite sure, when you think about the growth or the development of an athlete or anybody who decides to participate in some form of protest, like the different mechanisms that they use and the changing nature of it. And so you mentioned this idea, and obviously you're a former college athlete, and you probably, as you said, never really thought about mechanisms to drive money to support causes. So I'm wondering, what is that saying to us? Because I think, there is oftentimes people criticize the means in which people participate, and they say, well, we used to march or we used to do this, and that means it's better. I think you may have a term in the paper on slacktivism or something of the sort. And so I'm wondering if it's like a more nuanced approach to think about, okay, maybe I don't have to do all the work here, but I can find a way to support an organization that is doing a good job and align myself with it, which is something that I often think people don't do enough of. So I don't know if your thoughts on that. What were you surprised by that? Were you thinking these athletes are thinking at a higher level than even your time when you were a collegiate athlete?
Yeah, I wouldn't say that I was surprised by it, but I learned a lot for sure from these participants. I was not aware of exactly, how they would engage, and I was really impressed by the fiscal activism and taking the initiative to not just stop at, I don't have funds to donate myself, but to find a way to generate funds to then donate. I think that you're right. I think for a long time, activism was viewed as protest in particular, right? And marches and making speeches, but really protest, physical protest. And I think that the term slacktivism generated in part because of that, because online, you're not quite protesting. Maybe you're just, sitting on the couch at home, eating a sandwich and typing away. And so I think that the kind of physical and the time investment, the physical labor that is required of individuals who engage in marches, who protest in that way, is more than someone who's online, right? And so I think that for a long time, the value, like the currency of activism was based on that sacrifice, that level of sacrifice. I think there are other ways that collegiate athletes are sacrificing currently. And I think that also it's important to be more inclusive in terms of how what you recognize as activism. Because if you think about the platforms that collegiate athletes have, even if all they do is post online 1 or 2 times, the amount of people who are going to be exposed to the words that they're saying is typically vast, right? We had athletes from Power 5 institutions as a part of our study who had hundreds of thousands of followers, right? And so that's pretty big impact. And not all of those people would have been exposed to that type of ideology otherwise. So I think that, everyone has a role to play in activism, and there are all kinds of different ways that you can engage, that you can help. I think also, the thing that we were most interested in, again, with this paper was looking at how individuals are organizing their efforts. So we're looking at collective action, really. And I think what's interesting about what you pointed out, maybe devaluing somebody just donating money and not doing everything themselves. When you think about whatever the goal of any activist movement, when you think about how you can attain that goal, it's a lot easier to do when you have a group of people working together, right? And so it's just like a sports team. I mean, not everyone is going to do every single thing every time, but everyone has a role to play, right? And some of those roles might seem a little bit smaller than others, but they still matter, right? So I think that's important to recognize.
No, I think you're absolutely right. And we often sometimes criticize difference when it doesn't necessarily mean that people are less committed to a cause or something of the sort. And also, I wanted to go back to this thing of calling in versus calling out, because the way I think about it, especially when you think about the context, as you mentioned, cancel culture and so on, that kind of approach is really commendable in a sense, right? It's a sense of, I could probably use my platform and destroy you and bring a lot of attention, but it's almost like you're reaching across in some interesting ways, which I can only think would be more useful for the society. But was that something that you went in there thinking you would find?
I hoped so, but I didn't think so. I didn't think so at all, actually. So I was pleasantly surprised to see that our participants did engage in calling in. That's not to say that they didn't call out as well. And that's not to say that there's not a place for calling out, right? I think it's important to identify, when someone is engaging in behavior or making statements that are harmful to others, right? So it's not that, calling in is all good and calling out is all bad. And it's also not to say that any one of our participants consistently engaged in a single one of those approaches, right? So we had kind of a mixed bag. Almost every participant engaged in both at different times through different modalities, right? So participants were a lot more likely to call out online through social media than offline. And part of that is, participants shared, you can't verify the identity of who it is that you're talking to. You don't know for sure if they're really going to take the time to read your message and engage with it, or if they're just going to scroll past, or if they're just kind of ramped up and on a mission to just spew hate. And so you don't know whether or not you're going to get an equal level of investment. And for that reason, a lot of our participants were kind of uninterested in putting forth the effort to call in through social media. Similarly, a lot of times our participants would say through the offline channel, you know, I feel more compelled to call in when I'm talking to someone that I already know, like a family member, right? Distant cousin, any kind of relative, another teammate, someone that you encounter regularly at school. But we did have some participants who just felt really called. They felt like it was part of their purpose in life to help people who don't already agree with them understand their point of view. They felt that that was the most impactful way that they could engage. And so they would often go and give speeches at different schools, like locally, and they would call in with complete strangers. And they felt that that was very rewarding, not necessarily effective every single time, right? Not everyone's open enough for that type of talk to resonate, but yeah, so it was a mixed bag, but I was pleasantly surprised that quite a few of our participants call in.
No, I also like that, and obviously success rates vary, and you never know, you may not reach somebody at the moment you're speaking with them. It could be a delayed kind of impact when they reflect, they go home. But when people who might disagree on issues sit down and they have more of a friendly conversation, I think that makes society better. That I think that's the way to go, because it's really easy to just, and we all participating in it. Maybe you don't, but sometimes I do, where I have no time for certain people because of a position that they may take, and I'm just not into dealing with them, and that doesn't really help, right? I think sometimes the real struggle of maybe even making a friend of someone who we initially wouldn't be friends with is the way to make lasting change or meaningful change, I imagine. Again, we think about collegiate athletes and the institutional barrier to do this, right? I think even obviously professional athletes too have some barriers. You represent an organization, but I think in particular, you're best placed to think through this. How do they navigate this? How are the athletes that you're talking to who are making a difference or trying to make a difference feel about, you know, stepping away from maybe or participating in things that the university themselves wouldn't necessarily want to be a part of, or if they want to be a part of it, they want it to be, you know, scripted in a particular way?
Yeah. So actually, this is a really interesting question, because out of this same kind of body of data that we collected, my colleagues and I are coming out with another paper on how athletes demonstrate resilience through activism. And so that gets at exactly what you just asked, right? And so maybe we do another podcast to dive deep into that one. But the two main things that we found were really instrumental in terms of giving athletes an opportunity to start to develop resilience was that they had some form of an exposure to adversity, right? Which is extremely common in athletics and in activism. So that's almost a given. But also that they have social support, various forms of social support. And that's incredibly important, again, because activism really truly is embodied by collective action. It's very difficult to engage in activism truly as an island on your own. But also, our athletes in this particular study mentioned that they valued having support from friends and family and, you know, colleagues on campus who are not related to athletics, and that those ties were really valuable because they're exposed to, they get outside of the bubble of athletics, right? They're exposed to different perspectives, individuals who aren't constrained by quite the same number of variables, right? But also our participants really, really valued, they mentioned a very high value for the social support coming within athletics, right? It's coming from their teammates, coming from their coaching staffs, coming from athletic administrators at their university. And those things really empowered them to be able to kind of jump the hurdles, right? Face the constraints.
Yeah, I think it's important, and they're really young people taking on big things. And if they don't have that kind of support, it can be really tough and to navigate going to school and also being a sporting, you know, being in sports, which I think I'm fairly safe to say this, that if anyone understands what a Division I athlete, or even probably even a non-Division I athlete, but if you think about that in the collegiate system here, I just think those individuals are like professionals, and they operate almost similarly in terms of the load and the time they have to spend putting their bodies through a lot of things. and then at the same time you are expected to study hard and do well, and no one is giving away, at least I hope in most cases they aren't giving away free grades, and so it's a very difficult thing to do, and it's not like you can just go home and sleep and come back to training. You have to think through it. So I think I'm even much more, I think about athletes who do this at that level. I'm really sympathetic to them, and I'm really proud of them in some interesting ways, because they're stretching themselves relatively thin, I think. So let me ask you, I mean, maybe you don't want to give away this, I guess this could be IRB stuff, but did you come across athletes who were willing to say that they had a lot of institutional barriers? I know you had to, maybe not everything went into the paper in terms of how you share the data, but how did anybody get threatened to the point where they would be kicked off the team or anything? Any juicy information you want to share?
Yeah, so this would be more in the other paper, the resilience paper, because it focuses more on those constraints and barriers and how the athletes overcome them. So it's not in the paper we're talking about today, but we didn't have a single participant who said that they were going to get kicked off the team. We actually were very pleasantly surprised by the level of support that participants shared, their coaching staffs kind of demonstrated and offered them. And so that was really, really nice to see and hear. A lot of our participants did have coaches who would participate in marches with them, who would give a speech, right, at a rally of sorts, who would help organize town halls. And so that was really empowering to hear, and empowering for the athletes who shared their experiences with us. But we did have one participant in particular who received numerous death threats. She posted on social media, and one of her early posts during the pandemic went viral, and people were unkind. And so she struggled a lot with that, but she, for whatever reason, right, she said she felt extremely called to do this work. And so she continued to do it, regardless of the outcome, and in large part because of the social support that she had specifically from her coaching staff and teammates, she said was really helpful in navigating that.
One of the things that you were saying is this idea of the athletes that you spoke to never felt as if the institutions or the coaches were unsupportive. And so I was wondering if that's a function of maybe just the selection you ended up with in the sample, or could we expect it to be different at certain institutions? I don't want to call particular institutions out, but like maybe if they're in the running for a national title in football or something like that, would it be different if they're at a particular type of institution, say in the SEC or the Big Ten or something of the sort?
Sure. We did have Power 5 participants, some from the SEC, and we did have athletes who played football and basketball and, some kind of mainstream sports, if you will. So I think that our sample, we did a qualitative study, so it's not necessarily representative of, an entire population of collegiate athletes. And I do want to just make sure I clarify, it wasn't that none of our participants felt that they had any constraints put on them by their coaching staffs, but it was that all of our participants felt that they had at least some form of support from at least one member of the coaching staff. So, some participants, head coach doesn't want anything to do with this, doesn't want to know about it, doesn't want to be involved, but these two assistants, or the whole coaching staff is very supportive, or the assistants aren't taking interest, but the head coach is, right? And so I don't want to make it sound like, this was a very kind of homogeneous sample where every single person had the same experience. That's not the case. And I think that in a lot of cases, the coaching staff specifically, the institution specifically, the athletic director specifically, right, whoever those individuals are and whatever their feelings are about activism in general, about athlete activism in general, about their ability to actually support athletes in doing this work, that's going to play a role, right? So we had some football players who participated in our study who mentioned that they started the season with some different decals on their helmets, and that once donors saw that on the field, they started to withdraw support, right? And so now all of a sudden, certain things are jeopardized, right, for the program. The financial stability of the program is in jeopardy. And so for that reason, the team stopped, right? They took the decals off their helmets, and this was really frustrating for our participants. But they said that their coaching staffs were completely supportive, their athletic departments were completely supportive until the funding was pulled, and then they had to walk it back. They were told to find different ways to engage.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And there's a lot to unpack there because, ultimately, one of the big functions of college sports is to make money. They make a lot of money in college sports. I think that's the first thing they think about, but that's for a different conversation. But they also rely on a lot of from alumni support or boosters and all sort of people who sometimes may not necessarily agree with the same positions that athletes on the field may take, and that could create complicated relationships and withdrawing of support for athletic programs is a big deal, right? And obviously you often want to be on the right side of history, but then they think about where are we going to get money to fund this if we lose said big donor, or if the alumni is not happy, maybe the coach may also see that their job is on the line too. So there's a number of things at play here, and and I don't know, I often think that we see these things and it's not the thing that will ever be the main thing, because the main thing is the sport, right? And people want to see the sport, as we talked about at the top of the hour. But we know there's a lot of documented history for many years where sometimes you get in an atmosphere where all they think about is winning and nothing else, and academics may even come second. And now that you start to think about, you want to align yourself with a social issue or a political issue that other people might look at, that can be threatening to some people's understanding of what it means to keep a tight-knit unit and win. And I'm happy that what it seems is that most athletes didn't really face that kind of a backlash, but I can imagine I wonder though, let me ask you this, I wonder if sometimes the structure at these places, and maybe I'm asking for more insight than you can give, it's set up in a way that will dissuade you from actually doing these type of things.
Of course. If you think about the premise of athletics, right, is competition, and there are very specific goals, right? The goal of an athletic team is to win, right? And that's how you define success across the season, right? You want to win a lot of games, you want to win a championship, right? And the best way to go about doing that a lot of times is to make sure that the entire team kind of buys into whatever role each member serves, right, along that journey to attain that single shared goal, right? And so when athletes begin to engage in activism, and that draws a lot of attention to the team for something other than their athletic performance, that can be a big distraction, right? And so some coaches are supportive of that and recognize, different ways that they can go about maintaining team cohesion through that type of attention, and other coaches don't want to deal with it, right? And in some ways, I understand that is counter, right, to maybe not necessarily counter, but it is not necessarily aligned with the goal of winning. It's a bit different, right? It's a different activity. Having said that, oftentimes I think there's this trope that if athletes engage in activism, then they're distracted, right? And they're not working out enough, and they're not focused on the right things, and they're putting themselves ahead of the team. And if you think about it, activism is truly a selfless endeavor to take on, right? It's not about representing yourself. And so it's sort of silly to make the argument that the athlete's putting themselves above the team. I think the athlete is...
It's absolutely ridiculous.
Right, yeah. But that is definitely a mantra that I think a lot of coaches, will say, hey, everyone needs to be focused, everyone needs to put the team above themselves. And I think that more than actually coaches, it's fans on the outside, right, who will start to perpetuate that narrative and allow it to take hold that, hey, Colin Kaepernick's kneeling on the sideline, he must not be focused on the game, he should be locked in during the anthem, right? So that's something that, you have to navigate, but I don't think it's the biggest deterrent, right, to engage.
Yeah, no, you're right. I think it's generally the fans. If the fans would just ease off, we wouldn't probably be in half of these kind of situations. We saw it recently. If we think about another sport, the U.S. national team, women's team at the World Cup, the kind of backlash they were getting because all of a sudden, because they were fighting for a while for equal pay or other kind of endeavors that they were putting themselves around. And yeah, they didn't perform to the kind of standards that you would expect from a U.S. national team, but it's not like the rest of the world sits down and say, we're just going to give you a World Cup title, right? Like there are other things that contribute to athletes not performing at their best. Sometimes other teams are better, or, it's just not your time, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you shouldn't be doing things. Or we see it with this guy, I don't know if you know Marcus Rashford from Manchester United. He, during the pandemic focused so much on feeding a lot of children and calling out the government at the time. And once his form dips, anytime his form dips for Manchester United or the English national team, it's like, yeah, you're spending all your time being a philanthropist. People make, and I unfortunately, and maybe you agree, it's the one that will always perpetuate. I don't think we can get rid of a state where people won't bring attention to that kind of stuff.
I think publics will always find some reason, right? People are going to be critical of athletes, of anyone who's in the public eye, regardless, right? And they love you when you're up and they kick you when you're down. And that's just kind of part of it, right? That's how it goes, unfortunately. But I do think that this notion of like the monolithic athlete identity, athletes need to be male and strong, and to be strong, you have to look this way, and you have to play this sport to be considered a true athlete, right? I think that this kind of homogeneous notion of all athletes should be this and should just be sportsmen or sportswomen, right? I think that that's a bit antiquated, and I think that we're starting to move away from it. I think LeBron James has done a lot with Uninterrupted and his kind of mantra of more than an athlete. I think that also Players Tribune and different organizations like that have been giving athletes their own platform, their own voice to control their own narratives, right? And to allow publics to get to know them and to get to know their varied interests. I think that that's gone a long way, and I don't think that we're completely rid of this idea that athletes should just focus on sports, but I do think that we have come a long way, and that eventually I think it's possible that people will recognize athletes as multifaceted individuals, right, with more going for them than just their ability to kick a ball into a net or score a three-pointer
or run fast, right? Yeah,
exactly.
No, I think this is good. I mean, this has been a fabulous conversation so far. If I had to put you out of your comfort zone and predict things, which is not something that people like to do. So obviously we're having an election season next year. There's a lot of crisis happening in the world right now. Are we going to see more activism from athletes, from college athletes? Huh?
I think so. I think we've already seen quite a bit more activism than we have in recent years. Obviously during the civil rights movement, athlete activism was huge. And while it never has stopped, I think a lot of people think that it did, right? Because it did slow down in the 90s in particular. And it picked right back up, afterwards. And I think that with social media now as well, there's so much more opportunity to engage in activism. You can do it online, you can do it offline, you can use the competition space to your advantage and use the platform that's provided by that. Or you can, again, using LeBron James as an example, go a different route, keep it pretty separate from your athletic career, but still do a lot to make an impact. Utilize the funds that you've raised through your performance, right? And the resources that you now have at your fingertips to really affect change. And so I don't think that athlete activism is slowing down anytime soon. I think it'll pop right back up when the time's right.
Yeah, I certainly hope not. And I often say, and this is my personal feeling, is I often think that the athletes who are most talented, most gifted, who rise to the top of their sport, I think their responsibility is just a little bit more to do something for wider society than the middle of the road athlete who can be pushed aside. But everyone has a role to play.
Sure, yeah. The top athletes certainly have the largest platforms, right? The most opportunity.
All right, Lily. This has been a fabulous conversation. I want to thank you for joining me and for hopefully this was fulfilling for you. I don't know if it is, but you can tell me off here. And
It was great.
thank you. We'll definitely, I leave a link to your recent paper or article in the description for those who probably want to learn more. And
thank you.
yeah, I want to, let's not, this is the first time, but hopefully we can do it another time as well.
That sounds great. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lily.